The atmosphere in the courtroom had always carried tension, but today it felt deeper, more loaded. Like the very air was heavy with anticipation. Everyone seemed to know something major was about to unfold. But no one expected the shock that followed. Before we continue, viewer discretion is strongly advised. This content is strictly for entertainment and educational purposes only. This is the detailed courtroom testimony for the ongoing federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs as reported by Inner City Press. Also comment below where you are watching from and the time you're watching the video. Thank you. The prosecutor stepped forward with a small flash drive held like a trigger. She turned to the judge and calmly said, "Your Honor, the prosecution seeks to present newly recovered audio evidence. It was retrieved from a secure digital archive seized during the federal investigation of Mr. Combs' Miami estate." The judge raised an eyebrow. "What's the source?" "An encrypted file," she replied. "It's a phone call, recorded off-grid, between Mr. Combs and Bishop T.D. Jakes, dated August 9, 2022. That's roughly 6 months before the federal inquiry began." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. T.D. Jakes, the preacher who filled stadiums, the spiritual mentor whose sermons were shared in millions of homes, the man who'd spoken alongside presidents and counseled celebrities. The judge leaned forward, solemn. "Proceed." The room dimmed. The recording began. From the first second, it was obvious this wasn't small talk. The voices were familiar, calm but cautious, strategic. "Diddy, things are heating up. I need your covering. People are sniffing around LA. You built this with walls inside walls. They won't find the roots. Stay disciplined. Keep your circle tight." "And the others?" "Jakes, if they fold, they fold. Weak links always break first. Just keep the footage off the radar." A gasp cut through the silence. The conversation continued. "Diddy, there's chatter. Even J-Lo's team is poking around again. Let them. You owe no one the full truth. Confuse them. Feed them what they want to hear. Silence, my brother, is also a kind of wisdom. And if they talk, you remind them what's at stake. Not everyone gets to rise. Some disappear. That's the cost of equilibrium." A cry rang out from the gallery. A woman buried her face in her hands. A juror leaned forward, eyes wide, visibly shaken. This was not the T.D. Jakes they knew. This wasn't Sunday morning grace. This was power, wrapped in reassurance. A preacher's voice used to protect secrets. The audio ended. Lights returned. No one moved. Diddy sat still, expression blank. His legal team avoided eye contact. The prosecutor stepped forward slowly. "What you just heard," she began, "is more than a phone call. It's a conversation where spiritual counsel becomes tactical shielding, where silence is advised not as healing but as strategy, and where suffering is dismissed as weakness." She paused. "You heard him say it. The weak ones fold." That's what was said about the very people who've come forward, about those who had the courage to speak. That is not guidance. That is a system built to suppress. There was no rebuttal. Not yet. The judge leaned into his microphone. "We'll take a short recess." But no one moved. It was as if the courtroom itself had frozen. No one could decide what was more unsettling, Diddy's manipulation or the fact that someone so revered had helped craft it. When court resumed, everything felt different. More than legal, it felt spiritual, tainted. T.D. Jakes wasn't in the room, but his presence was in every corner, hanging over every word. The prosecutor returned, now holding a printed transcript, time-stamped and stamped with a federal watermark. "We would like to enter this transcript into the record," she said, her voice firm. "And we'd also like to present the next piece of evidence, an internal memo from Mr. Combs' legal team. It references something unusual, terms like spiritual firewall and divine handler. This memo was written just 2 days after the recorded conversation." The judge gave a nod. The screen lit up. It displayed the first page of the memo. Subject: Crisis Protocol, Spiritual Firewall Strategy. Date: August 11th, 2022. From Combs Enterprises to Executive Risk Team. Following this week's consultation, Mr. Combs has been advised to avoid direct statements. Public responses will be funneled through spiritual figures and trusted voices. The bishop will help manage faith community perception. Messaging to include themes like forgiveness, redemption, and spiritual testing. The room broke into whispers again. The prosecutor cleared her throat. Let's look at this closely. Spiritual intermediaries, theological framing. This memo isn't about faith, it's about influence, managing damage through borrowed trust. To damage control. It wasn't just advice, it was a system. It used scripture, not to heal but to deflect, not to uplift but to mislead. And Bishop T.D. Jakes' voice? It wasn't just in that conversation, it was in the entire strategy. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, her voice steady, not dramatic. This is no longer about whether T.D. Jakes merely knew what was happening. It's about how far his words were used to help hide it. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. Objection. There is no proof that Bishop Jakes saw or approved this memo. But the prosecutor didn't blink. Your Honor, we're not claiming authorship, we're showing influence. She stepped closer to the display. The memo uses phrases from the recorded call: spiritual firewall, this moment, alignment over exposure, divine handling. This isn't coincidence. This is language engineered to serve power. The judge nodded. Objection sustained, only for authorship, but influence may be considered. A new slide appeared on screen, handwritten notes from a personal assistance journal seized during a federal raid. One entry stood out: call Jakes. Circles nervous, get a word on containment and loyalty, use scripture. The courtroom went silent. This was no longer speculation. These were receipts. Dots once scattered, now connected with painful clarity. In the gallery, Jennifer Lopez sat tight-lipped, arms folded. Her own testimony had echoed shadows of Diddy's world, but even she hadn't realized the depth of spiritual insulation that protected him. The prosecutor resumed, stepping slowly before the jury box. You've heard the call, you've seen the memo, now you've read the private notes. This wasn't just about hiding misconduct. This was about building a fortress, one made of trust, faith, and fear. She paused, and when victims finally broke their silence, they weren't met with Diddy's denial. They were met with their pastor's scripture, their bishop's sermons. Their faith turned against them. The silence that followed was louder than any gavel. At the defense table, Diddy leaned into his attorney, whispering fast. His lawyer scribbled notes, flipping files in a panic. For the first time, Diddy's confidence looked fractured, not because of what had been revealed, but because the one man who'd protected him now stood implicated in the collapse. The judge broke the stillness. This court recognizes the spiritual memo and private assistance notes as materials supporting the obstruction charge. They will be submitted for review. There was no applause, no movement, just an eerie stillness that sat heavy over the room. Something sacred had been cracked open, and now faith itself was being examined as evidence. The energy shifted, no longer shock, it was grief. This wasn't about celebrity anymore, it was about belief, about how power borrowed the language of healing to defend itself. When the court reconvened after recess, the judge looked exhausted. Not just from the weight of the case, but from what had been exposed about the institutions meant to guide. The prosecutor approached again, this time holding another file. Your Honor, we now present a comparison between the recorded conversation and Bishop T.D. Jakes' public sermons from the past 5 years. Before the screen even turned on, the courtroom reacted. Gasps, shifts, tension. Our investigation matched several phrases from the leaked call to statements made by Bishop Jakes during sermons and media appearances. The overlap is not incidental. The screen lit up. Column A, leaked phone call, Aug 2020. Column B, public sermons and interviews, 2017 to 2022. A, not everyone deserves the full story. B, sometimes your silence is your strongest sermon. Speak only what serves the kingdom. A, stay aligned. Keep the circle tight. B, those who are assigned to your life won't question your silence, they'll protect it. Use faith to settle fear. B, between fear is disobedience. Faithfulness includes knowing when to stay quiet. A collective breath was released. Sharp, uncomfortable. Let's be clear, the prosecutor said. We are not putting faith on trial. We're showing how it was used, not to protect, but to control. These weren't words of comfort, they were coded instructions. She stopped, letting the gravity sink in, and they worked, for years. The judge leaned forward. Has the authenticity of this material been confirmed? Yes, she replied. All sermons are publicly archived. Each quote has a timestamp. We've mapped them against key moments in Diddy's legal exposure. They're synchronized, subtly, consistently. Diddy didn't speak, but his hands wouldn't stop moving, fidgeting, rubbing. His color had faded. A man who built his empire on charisma now sat crumbling in the weight of collusion. The prosecutor turned to the next slide. But this time it wasn't a quote. It was a direct message, submitted anonymously by a former staff member from Bishop Jakes' ministry. The message was crystal clear. It was an internal exchange between one of the bishop's aides and Diddy's team in October 2022, just weeks after the FBI's inquiry went public. Staffer, Bishop says you're covered. He'll remind the faithful who you really are. Sunday's message will do the work. Diddy, tell him I appreciate the firewall. We good. No one in the courtroom gasped this time. They were past that. There was only devastation. Even those who had once admired both men now sat quietly, because this wasn't miscommunication. This was coordination. It wasn't about slipping up, it was about building a fortress. A spiritual infrastructure not to serve the hurting, but to shield the powerful from accountability. The prosecutor stepped back, shoulders squared. Your Honor, we move to include these documents as supporting evidence. They help establish that Bishop Jakes knowingly and systematically provided ideological cover for Mr. Combs to silence witnesses and manipulate narratives. The judge said nothing at first. He scanned the exhibits in front of him, glanced toward the gallery, then looked the prosecution in the eye. This court accepts the submission, he finally said. And I will note personally that this morning's presentation redefines the depth of influence we're confronting. We're not just addressing crime, but betrayal masquerading as mentorship. The gavel struck, but the echo that followed didn't sound like law. It sounded like something else collapsing, something sacred. Because this wasn't just about the courtroom now. It was about the people who'd sat in pews, clung to sermons, prayed for guidance, never realizing those very words were being used as camouflage. As the next session resumed, the tone was no longer sharp with anger. It was heavy. The fire of outrage had cooled into something colder, disillusionment. More witnesses had already unraveled the machinery behind Diddy's public persona. But what was unfolding now was deeper, a realization that faith had been weaponized. The scriptures meant to heal had been scripted to confuse. Words that once inspired had now been co-opted to control. The prosecutor stood once again. But this time she held a different kind of folder. Thin, plain, and quiet. She explained it wasn't new evidence, it was confirmation. Today, she said, we present the signed affidavit of a man who worked closely within Bishop Jakes' inner ministry team for 5 years. He never spoke publicly. He was never named in a lawsuit, but he was the one who managed the timing, the speeches, the messages. She flipped open the folder and began reading. From 2017 to 2022, I coordinated off-record messaging for Bishop T.D. Jakes. I filtered sensitive communications from public figures, including Mr. Combs. I was responsible for ensuring that whenever a public scandal emerged, our spiritual statements aligned with Diddy's legal needs. We were told to prioritize messages around loyalty, silence, and endurance. We knew what the audience needed to hear to stay calm. We gave them that. The prosecutor lifted her eyes to meet the jury's. This wasn't guesswork. This man wasn't reacting. He was preparing the script. She turned the page and continued reading. Entire weekends were structured around controversy timelines. When something serious broke in the press, Bishop Jakes would be briefed. Within 3 days, there'd be a sermon emphasizing how storms test loyalty or how betrayal always comes before breakthrough. It was always crafted to align with Diddy's latest issue. A slide popped up on the screen behind her. A timeline labeled Sermons versus Scandals. The left side listed media headlines. June 2018, assault allegations linked to Diddy's NYC party. November 2019, leaked security footage of a brawl at his estate. March 2022, anonymous whistleblower files report with the FBI. The right side displayed sermon titles delivered by Bishop Jakes within 72 hours of each incident. Brotherhood in the fire. The enemy hates alignment. Hold the vision, ignore the noise. This time, no one gasped. The jury didn't move. The gallery didn't blink. The grief was too loud. These weren't parallels. These were matches. strategically timed, spiritually framed. The prosecutor didn't raise her voice. "This isn't encouragement," she said softly. "This is emotional engineering. These messages weren't designed to heal the faithful. They were meant to sedate them." She turned slightly toward Diddy and added, "He didn't just have publicists. He had a pulpit." The judge's voice came low. "Is there more from the witness?" "Yes," the prosecutor answered. She continued reading. "I remember one particular phone call. Bishop said, 'We're not lying. We're guarding the truth until the world is ready for it.' That was after the Miami tapes started circulating. That was after people started whispering about the East Wing." The courtroom didn't stir. But something invisible did, a wave of recognition. In the gallery, Paris Jackson leaned forward, expression hard. Jennifer Lopez sat still, staring blankly ahead. The realization hung heavy. This wasn't about personal guilt. It was about systems, the most untouchable of them all. Faith. The prosecutor's tone dropped lower, slower. This witness also submitted internal emails between staff. They coordinated messages, held encrypted prayer circles to manage public image, and compiled a document labeled Emergency Alignment Protocols. She held up a photocopy. Protocol Step 1, identify the threat. Step 2, call Jakes. Step 3, shape the narrative. Step 4, remind the faithful of Diddy's purpose. Step 5, silence the noise. Elevate the mission. The judge leaned back, visibly stunned. Even he seemed shaken. The prosecutor spoke with quiet conviction. This was never just about what Diddy did. It's about how he kept doing it for so long, because someone meant to speak for God was instead scripting for a man accused of using his empire to exploit. Court adjourned without fanfare. No applause. No arguments. Just the eerie quiet of collective realization. What once felt sacred now wore the face of manipulation. Behind the polished sermons and emotional prayers was a man who'd used trust like a weapon. And as the gavel echoed through the room, the courthouse no longer felt like a place of justice. It felt like a sanctuary of broken faith. Each day of the trial had stripped away layers. But today was different. The slow unraveling of spiritual complicity hit harder than anything before. Because criminal acts make people angry, but betrayal through Scripture? That fractures something deeper, trust. When the court reconvened, the weight of that fracture filled every seat. The prosecutor stepped forward with something no one expected, a voicemail. Submitted anonymously by a former executive assistant within Bishop Jakes' ministry, the file was dated late 2022, after the first reports against Diddy began making headlines. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "this is a private message from Bishop Jakes to a senior member of Comms Enterprises. It was left in the aftermath of the initial investigations. We present it as evidence of strategic alignment, crafted behind closed doors." The judge gave a solemn nod. "Admit it." The lights dimmed. The courtroom stilled. Then the voice played. "Sean," the bishop began, "I know it feels like the ground's shifting under you, but you and I both know storms don't break the chosen. They just expose the jealous." The tone was even, polished, as though rehearsed. "The narrative always bends," he continued. "If you hold the pulpit, let them talk. We'll speak louder, through the faithful, through the framing. Truth isn't always loud. But redemption? Redemption can be orchestrated." A wave of gasps spread through the gallery. The voicemail continued. "I'll shape the Sunday message. You stay off the grid, let the public speculate, let them accuse, but don't let them forget. Men fall, but the anointed rise. I've already spoken to the right ears in Atlanta," the circle holds. Now the room was still. The silence wasn't confusion, it was recognition. That what they'd heard wasn't comfort, it was coordination. Not spiritual wisdom, but crisis management in ecclesiastical packaging. The prosecutor allowed the silence to breathe before stepping forward. This wasn't comfort. This was a strategy. This was a pulpit used as PR. She turned slowly toward Diddy. He built his empire behind velvet curtains and soundproof walls, behind celebrity brunches and unlisted guest names. But what he never imagined was that his spiritual cover would be caught whispering the playbook. Diddy didn't move. His stare was blank, his face unreadable. There were no more defenses to call. His final shield had just cracked on audio. The prosecution approached the jury box slowly. This trial isn't only about the illegal. It's about a man who sat on top of silence, and the voices that helped him build it. She held up the voicemail transcript. This proves it. Faith wasn't just a tool in this story, it was a weapon, and the hand that wielded it will now face the truth. The judge closed the folder with care. This court is adjourned until closing arguments. But the people didn't rush to stand. They sat, still, processing what had just been said, because today wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning, not of evidence, but of belief. The courtroom reopened under a tension that had changed shape. It wasn't legal pressure anymore. It was spiritual mourning. Not for Diddy, whose downfall had become a matter of time. This mourning was for the ones who had prayed beneath pulpits, who had listened, believed, and shaped their lives around the idea that sermons were sacred. The judge re-entered, flanked by added security. The next evidentiary session had been declared partially sealed. Media presence limited, tensions high. Everyone inside knew what that meant. Something was about to surface that would go beyond charges and headlines. It would challenge the institutions people looked to for guidance. The prosecutors stood with a single folder, thin but clearly potent. "Your Honor," she said, "we submit into evidence a series of emails. This thread involves a financial consultant closely tied to Bishop T.D. Jakes and a risk management firm affiliated with Combs Enterprises." The judge nodded. "Continue." The prosecutor stepped forward, eyes focused, voice calm. "These emails reveal something far beyond routine PR strategy. They detail a coordinated spiritual apparatus, one engineered to manipulate image, finances, and messaging before any allegation went public." The screen lit up. The jury stared at the first subject line. Subject, Phase 2 Containment, Faith Layering Initiative. From Redacted Financial Advisor to Redacted Reputation and Security Management, Combs Enterprises. Date, October 5, 2022. We recommend moving forward with the brand purity reset. Bishop J can lead Sunday messaging into the wilderness season approach. Launch a donation campaign under themes of healing and forgiveness. Frame recent headlines as persecution for truth-telling. Align Haley B. narrative with distraction by darkness language. Partner ministry will help redirect her. If she resists, invoke reconciliation theology angle. The courtroom sat frozen. The prosecutor gestured at the screen. "This isn't spiritual comfort, it's strategic distraction. Faith wasn't the remedy, it was the marketing." She clicked forward to the next email. Subject, Payout Optics, Spiritual Endorsement Buffer. From Redactix Office to Date, October 7th, 2022. Consider having Bishop offer a quote next Sunday. Sometimes the price of obedience is being misunderstood by man while honored by God. If timed right, it will pacify mid-tier donors and recast Sean as enduring a job-like trial. A sob came from the gallery. The judge didn't call for silence. No one could. Because these weren't just emails. They were scripts, templates for redemption, instructions on how to frame scandal as sacrifice, and they were written before any formal charges, before Haley Bieber ever spoke, before the public even suspected. The prosecutor spoke low. "Your Honor, these communications were sent when the world was still asleep, before anyone asked hard questions. They didn't wait to deny. They prepared to mislead." She turned to the jury, her voice steady. "You've heard the recordings. You've seen the memos. And now you've read the plan. The language of healing was hijacked to protect the architects of harm." She gently closed the folder. This is no longer about who lied. It's about how they rehearsed the lie and dressed it in scripture. Diddy sat slumped, lifeless in his chair. His head bowed as if trying to vanish. His lawyers no longer whispered. No objections. No notepads moving. Because the illusion had finally shattered. The judge spoke with weight. "This court recognizes the communications as evidence of premeditated narrative control using religious institutions. These materials will weigh heavily in deliberations." And just like that, the room collectively exhaled. But it wasn't relief. It was resignation. They had seen the blueprints, how sin was draped in scripture, how fear was dressed as divine order, how a man who once preached healing had built a fortress around trauma. Outside, the sky had darkened. A storm rolled in. Thunder echoed softly like grief groaning through clouds. Inside, the atmosphere matched. Restless. Reckoning. When the court reconvened, there was no small talk. No noise. Just silence. Expectant and raw. The judge entered. He looked heavier than before, not in his robe but in his presence. His eyes scanned the room, not as a jurist, but as someone standing amid an unraveling. The prosecutor stood, hands empty. "Your Honor," she said, "this is our final piece of evidence. There is no audio, no video, just a single letter, a confession." Gasps rippled, not from spectacle but from fatigue. What more could there be? "This letter comes from inside the circle," she said. "It was handwritten, dated last week. Voluntarily submitted, authenticated." The courtroom leaned in. "It's from someone known as J.H., a former assistant, a mentee of Bishop T.D. Jakes." A hush swept the gallery. She stepped to the center. "I will read it now, with the court's permission." The judge nodded once. She unfolded the letter. "To whom it may concern, I worked for Bishop Jakes from 2019 to early 2023. I was young, hungry for purpose. I thought I was serving something divine. But over time, I realized I wasn't working for God. I was working for a man who knew exactly what Sean Combs was doing and helped him hide it. I've seen the memos. I delivered burner phones. I prepped statements meant not to heal, but to shield. I watched sermons built around scandals, written like scriptures, delivered like smoke. I was told never to question it. Bishop called it strategic ministry. I sat in green rooms where Diddy laughed while victims broke in silence. I watched the bishop hug men who paid to be blessed and protected. I deleted files. I shaped betrayal into divine testing. This wasn't about God. It was about empire, ego. And I stayed too long. The room was silent. I stayed silent because I believed, because I was told that to doubt was disloyal, that to ask questions was to betray the kingdom. I'm writing this because the truth is louder now than my fear, because victims deserve more than silence. Because redemption without accountability is just a rebrand. I know what I did, and I know who I protected. And now I choose to protect the truth. The letter ended. The courtroom didn't erupt, it didn't gasp, it wept, quietly, slowly. It was the collective heartbreak of realizing that the voices meant to defend the wounded had instead helped create the wounds. The prosecutor's voice broke that silence, soft but steady. This letter is not just one person's shame. It's proof of many people's pain. It confirms that the pulpit was not only used to preach, but to protect. Not the vulnerable, but the predator. She folded the paper slowly. "We are not here to try faith. We are here to confront the man who used faith to build a fortress around his guilt, and the man who helped reinforce those walls with holy words and unholy intent." She turned to the jury. "Every layer of this trial has revealed the same truth. Diddy didn't do this alone. He had architects, strategists, pastors, and finally, the silence is broken." The judge whispered, "This court will recess before final statements begin tomorrow." No one moved, because no one could walk away from what they just heard without carrying it. The letter bore no public signature, no face, but the voice behind it echoed louder than any defense argument combined. A voice from within, one that chose truth over loyalty, light over silence, justice over legacy. The final day arrived without spectacle. No flashing cameras, no chants from protesters, no media circus outside the courthouse. The storm had passed, but the wreckage lingered. Everyone who stepped into that room understood what today was. Not just the end of a trial, but the end of an illusion. The judge entered slowly. His expression was solemn, not stern. The weight of what he'd presided over wasn't something rules or protocol could shake off. What unfolded inside this courtroom had not been about legal technicalities. It had been about truth, bitter, buried, and finally spoken aloud. The prosecutor stood one last time. "Your Honor, members of the jury, today marks the conclusion of a trial unlike any in recent memory. We came here to determine whether Sean Combs had engaged in criminal behavior." She paused. "We found far more." She stepped forward, not with force but with reverence. "We uncovered the architecture of silence. We exposed how a man built an empire on fear, not alone, but with help. And the most painful part is, that help came from the voice people trusted most." She turned toward the courtroom. T.D. Jakes was not charged, but in this trial, he was revealed. Not because someone accused him, but because, without knowing it, he confessed. In strategy memos, in private recordings, in whispers passed between power and pulpit. She paused again. Every word he spoke to shield a friend became a confession heard by the world. The room was still. Hearts clenched in silent agreement. His voice once stood for faith, but here it stood for coordination, for damage control, for obstruction. When victims asked for help, she said, he gave them scripture, packaged to protect the man who hurt them. Her voice grew stronger now. This wasn't just a moral failure. It was betrayal disguised as guidance, scripture used as sedative, grace extended to the predator, while the wounded were told to pray for strength and silence. She turned to the jury. And yet, through all of it, the truth still found its way out, through a hidden phone, through a broken assistant's letter, through a crack in the pulpit itself. She looked at Diddy. He didn't look back. Sean Combs didn't fall because he was hated, she said. He fell because he was seen. And once people saw the machine behind the image, once they realized who helped him polish his halo while victims screamed behind closed doors, they couldn't unsee it. The judge asked, "Do you rest your case?" She nodded. "We rest." And just like that, the trial was done. But no one stood, no one clapped, no one exhaled, because the damage wasn't theatrical, it was sacred. Faith had been fractured, influence dissected, power dragged out of the shadows and forced to answer. Diddy sat like a man unrecognizable from the one who first entered that room, his face hollow, his kingdom gone. And in homes across the country, where people once watched his music videos or listened to Bishop Jake's Sunday sermons, there was now a silence, not from confusion, but from clarity, because the truth had finally been louder than the brand. As people filed out of the courtroom, heads low, hearts heavy, they weren't just leaving a room. They were leaving the ruins of a legacy, a stage where the most trusted voice stood beside the most feared one. Not as shepherd and sinner, but as co-architects of silence. Stay tuned and subscribe to the channel if you want to stay updated on the Sean Diddy Combs trial. Also share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.